and welcome to this last webinar of Exhaustion. The project started in 2019 and ends today, actually. And today the webinar is about heat health action planning in cities. My name is Astrid. I'm from Cicero, and I'll try to guide you through today. During this webinar, we want to explore the following questions. How can heat protection and reduction of air pollution be included in heat health action planning? What needs to be considered when adopting heat health action planning to local context? And what are the effective measures for developing a climate resilient low emission city, and how can these be integrated into regional or local heat health action plans? Just a few practical things up front. If you have questions, please use the Q&A and type them in there, and then we will see if we have time in the end to read some of them out loud. And for your information, we will actually record this webinar, just as you know. But I'll start now by giving the floor to Kristin Aunal, Research Director at Cicero and Head of the Exhaustion project, that will give us some insights. Floor is yours, Kristin.
Thank you. I will share the screen, see if it works. Is this the correct version?
Yes.
Yeah. So welcome everyone to this, as Astrid said, the last stakeholder meeting in this 4-year project. So we are excited to present some of our results and discuss some of the policy implications of our work. Yeah, there. So just as a background, as probably not necessary to tell in this group, but we have to prepare for increasing temperatures, probably exceeding 1.5 degrees, and more brutal heat waves. So this is kind of the backdrop for the topic today. 2023 was the hottest year on record, actually with a broad margin, with the global temperatures close to 1.5 degrees limit, which is the target in the Paris Agreement. For the first time, the World Meteorological Organization says that it is more likely than not that the global surface temperature will exceed pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees in at least one of the next 5 years. The figure here shows the example from work in Exhaustion, where we have been looking at projections for heat waves. The heat waves are projected to increase faster in duration and in magnitude. Example here is the so-called warm spell duration index, which is one of many indicators of heat waves. They will increase towards the mid-century, and Southern Europe is projected to experience the most intense heat waves and to encounter the largest increase. There will be increases in different areas as well. So one important part of the Exhaustion project, which addresses the relationship between temperature and cardiopulmonary mortality in Europe, and the projections for these impacts and socioeconomic costs. So one thing was to investigate the so-called exposure-response relationship between temperature and mortality. And this figure, I'm not going to go into details, but the point in showing this figure with all these U-formed curves, which is the relationship between temperature and mortality, is to just illustrate that these look very different across European cities. So that basically means that the vulnerability in the population across Europe differs when it comes to heat and impact on mortality. And one important part of Exhaustion was, in addition to establish these functions, was also to try to say something and investigate the factors behind the differences. We can call those vulnerability factors, and they can be at different levels. There can be individual factors. For instance, old people or old adults are more sensitive to heat. Women seem to be more sensitive. If you have some comorbidities like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, there are also indications that people are more sensitive. And also other, like being pregnant, small infants, low mobility. There are also area level social factors that seems to have an impact. For instance, if population in an area with low education, high unemployment rates, different indicators of deprivation, seems to be more sensitive to heat, or there are higher mortality rates. And then we have the area level ambient factors. And in exhaustion, we have particularly been interested in looking into how air pollution can impact the relationship between mortality and heat stress. So that is an important outcome, that we find that there is strong modification impacts of particulate matter and also for heat health relationship. Also, high population density and being urbanized are indicators. All of these are things related to city level factors. Also, the lack of green space shows to be in our results to be an important factor enhancing the vulnerability, which is relevant to how we can discuss adaptation measures. So this is just a brief, I will not go into the details of the different topics here because I don't have the time, but on our webpage you can find illustrations and visualizations of the work we are doing. This is an illustration of the how air pollution modifies the heat impact. So basically it shows that if it's both very hot and very polluted, mortality rates increases to a large extent than if it is hot but not so polluted. And we have these indicators for different cities across Europe. This is another illustration related to this question about green space and to what extent cities that are graying, that means losing green space, might be related to increased surface level temperature and then subsequently increased heat stress for the population. So we find using satellite data that many Western and European cities are actually warming fast and they are losing green space. So that's what's illustrated in these figures. So it's graying and it's warming, greening and cooling. And we see, at least for some regions, that it's a quite strong linear relationship. Northern European cities are warming slowly and show no strong trends for greening and graying. And most of Southern European cities actually are warming slowly, and some of the cities, or most of the cities, are actually greening. So I will not repeat the questions Astrid referred to, the topic for this webinar. So I will stop here, but I have one last slide, which I would like to invite you to read our so-called white paper. So as we have told, this is the last day of our project, and we have gathered we have made summaries of all of the different parts of the project and collected in what we call white paper. So you can download this report and individual sheets if you're interested. And we will next week, I think, send out a newsletter where you will find the link to this white paper and the information, which is a very nice summary in very brief terms of the different findings. So welcome to this seminar. I hope you will enjoy it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristin. And then I will pass the floor on to Antonio Gasparini from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. You will give us some insights on health impact projections.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm trying to share my presentation and my slides. I hope you can see it. Very happy to be here. So my role today is to provide an overview of some of the results from the exhaustion projects, in particular about the health impacts of heat and adaptation strategies in Europe, which I hope can feed into a discussion about policies and interventions in a way to attenuate the impacts of climate change in the future, and especially in cities. Now, within Exhaustion, we have carried out very large and comprehensive studies on historical and projected temperature-related excess mortality in Europe, and in particular, the idea of these analysis assessment was about being comprehensive and therefore mapping all the impacts across Europe. We use a collection of publicly available databases from different sources, which is something that probably I will stress again later on. And we have inspected, in a way, impacts for both heat and cold across the spectrum. So some of the results, I don't want to bore you with statistical and methodological details, so I will go straight to the results. And this graph is showing the impacts in terms of excess deaths for both cold on the left and heat on the right. Please note that there is a difference in the scales used in here, and in fact, cold is creates, in a way, is associated with a much higher mortality across Europe, something that I will touch later. But I will want to focus on the right-hand side of the plot, showing the substantial differences in terms of impacts of age-specific death rates across Europe, with significant changes across regions and in particular countries. And this map in here is reporting it more accurately, what is the heat-related standardized excess death rates, showing that there is, first of all, big regional gradients with risk increases going from north to south, but also going from west to Eastern Europe, and therefore Eastern and Southern Europe will be are already much more affected by excess mortality due to heat. There are also more, let's say, nuanced differences. For example, you can see that coastal areas tends to have an attenuated risk if compared to inner regions, but of course, this is within a pattern of extreme differences across places. Now, in addition to this, we have complemented the results we have presented on a broad scale, let's say city level across Europe, with some analysis done at a small area and therefore at a higher resolution. And here I'm presenting some results from that we extracted from an analysis on the UK, showing again the standardized excess rates for heat, showing that across the territory of England and Wales, there are extreme differences, especially with cities and urbanized areas much more at risk. And we can also let's say, focus our attention on specific cities, for example, London in here, showing that there is an extreme variation, not just between cities, but also within cities in areas more or less affected. And in particular, we can focus again in a borough of London, for example, the borough of Camden here, showing that specific small areas and therefore parts of the city can be affected differentially by impacts of heat. Now, why this has happened? This is related to the way we modeled these risks, and in particular, we linked differences to specific vulnerability drivers that also can be seen as potential adaptation strategies. And in particular, we have collected information on demographic, socioeconomic, health, housing, landscape, and climatological factors, and use these differences in this factor to understand how the risk could be different in different places. And in here, you have a map of the variation in these drivers across the territory, showing that some of them can be related to a differential impact across due to heat across the England and Wales. Now, the strategy of the current research is especially identifying the role of each of these different drivers in increasing or decreasing the vulnerability to heat, and therefore link this information to specific plans for adaptation strategies that we can implement. Now, a different part of the analysis we have done in EXHAUSTION was to project the impact in the future. And in here, this is showing the trend in excess mortality under 3 different scenarios of socioeconomic, but especially climate change projections, going from the milder scenario on the left to the more extreme scenarios in the right. And what is showing in here is that, of course, under these scenarios, Heat-related mortality, which is the red line, are always increasing. Cold-related mortality are always decreasing, probably expectedly so. But an important evidence that we have in here is that under the three scenarios, but especially in the more extreme scenarios, the so-called net effect for the difference in the increase in heat and decrease in cold is actually positive, showing that notwithstanding the decrease in cold-related mortality, there will be an increase in impacts related to heat, especially under the more extreme scenarios. Now, these projections also show a geographical difference, and therefore, consistent with what we have seen, some areas will be much more affected, in particular under more extreme scenarios, for example, showing here 3 degrees increase in global mean temperature. And of course, you have areas just like north of Europe that will not experience much of increase in so-called net effect, but most of Europe, and especially the southern and eastern part, will be very badly affected, especially under more extreme scenarios of climate change. Now, last slides, the first one presenting the development of web tools that we are using to disseminate these research much broadly, not just through scientific articles, but also through this, for example, web tools that everybody can access. And I put a link below showing in a way a web tool that everybody can use to visualize, but also extract specific figures for regions, countries, or specific cities. And I would probably invite all of you to have a look at them. Finally, some policy recommendations that we drafted during a recent workshop. And of course, the next speakers will be much more specific about that. But the main messages is, first of all, prioritize mitigation, because the impacts will be, in any case, much stronger under more extreme climate change scenarios. That adaptation should be based on policy supported by specific evidence from scientific studies, and that we have already produced it, but we will produce also in the future based on the research in exhaustion. And of course, there is extreme differences across geographies, and therefore it's important to differentiate national and local policies and to, in a way, tailor intervention to specific local vulnerabilities and situations, and especially invest in infrastructure, especially data infrastructure, because this is very relevant and critical to produce evidence that can feed into this policy planning. So thank you very much, and I hope I've been, I kept my time.
Thank you, Antonio. And I will give the floor directly to Francesca Di Donato, working at the Department of Epidemiology, Lazio Region Health Service in Rome, in Italy. So, Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
So yes, I'm going to briefly talk about what we've been carrying out in exhaustion and another related project, looking at the heat health action planning in Europe and current evidence and gaps to further enhance what we can do at local level in cities, but how we can really improve response to extreme heat within our cities, especially focusing on vulnerable subgroups. So in 2021, with the WHO revised its evidence on effective prevention measures towards heat and health in the European region. And together with this, a survey was also carried out, and this came to publication as well from the group that worked on this, in which we sort of tried to assess and carry out an evaluation of what the status of heat adaptation planning, so HAPs, within Europe were, in terms of the different components that should be implemented within heat adaptation plan according to the WHO. And the findings that are summarized here, you can see that although we found that across Europe over years, there had been a development and further implementation in the heat adaptation plans, and these have become more specific over time, not all the core components have equally been implemented. So most countries have implemented and defined the lead body, have heat warning systems. They have defined information plans and strategies to reduce exposure. They have identified vulnerable groups, but there's less known on what these actions and measures are actually entail, what they actually entail, and what they've formally been doing, and they've not been evaluated as well. Preparedness of health and social services are also lacking in the majority of warning systems, and there is interdepartmental collaboration across the different levels, so nationally, regionally, and then at local level, should also become current practice and should be collaborating at a, on a more daily basis in order to enhance the response measures to heat throughout the different countries and the different settings. And finally, heat adaptation plans should no longer be standalone systems. They should be integrated in wider climate change response policies and actions, especially thinking of climate change adaptation plans throughout Europe and the different countries and settings, but also different measures that are put in place, both in terms of climate change adaptation and mitigation, which all affect the health of the population that is living in a specific area, hence should also be targeted to the health domain with a greater extent. Within both EXHAUSTION and the MBEL project, which is also linked to this work, we carried out a literature review focusing on not only the adaptation measures put in place in response to heat and climate change, but also focusing on the vulnerability factors of individuals. And so who is most at risk to heat, and therefore should be the populations to which we should target these actions. And a lot of work has been carried out over the last decades in identifying who these people are. It's not only the elderly, we know more about who these people that are most at risk are. It can be children, it can be athletes, it's pregnant women and small children, workers, especially outdoor workers, or carrying out very heat active and very high intense activities, but it's also people living in deprived area or homeless people, and there's also differences by gender that need to be accounted for. When we look at the clinical conditions as well, we found there's a lot of evidence on those subgroups of population that are more at risk because of their chronic conditions they have. So if it's people with respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, diabetes, for example. And again, we also looked at how might be some interaction between the vulnerability factors, between who's exposed to heat and who is exposed to other co-exposures during hot summers, for example, wildfires or air pollution, as you can see. And what we found and what is known in the literature is that these vulnerable groups are mostly the same people. So when they're exposed to a series of different environmental exposures, they are the ones that always suffer the most and are more at risk. So it really needs to go in the direction of addressing these subgroups and targeting prevention measures towards these subgroups. And this is what the focus has been on within the project, trying to identify what can be done. So we know who they are very well, what can actually be done, what is being done, what are the other gaps, so we can improve policy and response. And so the work that we carried out also identified both through a gap analysis and a literature review, and a gap analysis which entailed interviews with a whole series of stakeholders and experts in the field. And we found a whole series of different prevention measures that have been addressed towards vulnerable subgroups, which are highlighted here. I won't go into too much detail, but obviously it entails education and training campaigns specifically targeted to healthcare and social workers, information campaigns with the dissemination of information. This is also usually passive, so there's no real response in terms of how this information works, what they do with it, is it really effective? So generally, overall, there should be more evaluation of the different measures of the processes that are put in place, but also in terms of the outcomes, so how we are reducing or helping to reduce the impacts on health. Infrastructural measures, so retrofitting and improving indoor climatic conditions is also an important aspect, and some prevention has been targeted in that sense. Healthcare facilities have defined emergency protocols, and these can be different. They can be at institutional level, so controlling indoor temperatures and ventilation when it's very hot, or at individual level for patients, so hydration, carrying out health surveillance of the patient when it's very hot, adjusting their medical or their medical therapies, or rescheduling outdoor activities, especially within nursing homes and elderly care settings. There's specific activities regarding acclimatization interventions and cooling strategies, mostly for workers and athletes, where most of the work and the prevention measures have been carried out. There is evidence of these, and they have also been evaluated. When we're talking about heat adaptation plans in a more general sense, what we found that there was less evidence of what is actually being carried out. Here, I'm just summarizing what I briefly mentioned before. So in terms of the public health prevention measures on those different preventive measures and domains, stratified by the different vulnerable subgroups. And as you can see, a lot has been done in terms of information for the different vulnerable subgroups. So much so has acclimatization and cooling and hydration actions, while the other ones are very scarce. And that suggests that we really need to not only improve the research, but carry out more evaluation of what we're doing from a public health perspective. And again, as you can see from the map on the right-hand side, the studies are geographically limited to specific areas. So again, we need to have more studies and more evidence of what is being done around the world to improve our knowledge, but also to share information between the different stakeholders. In terms of gaps we found from the literature review on vulnerable groups and heat adaptation and response measures in Europe, one of the key factors when we carried out the literature review that we were looking at co-exposures and prevention measures, and the evidence was not only limited, but mostly inexistent, if not for very specific contexts, for example, for firefighters exposed to both heat and to air pollution and the toxic material that when it's burnt, essentially. Interventions are tailored for vulnerable subgroups, but their evaluation of these interventions are never carried out or reported systematically. There is a need for reporting and monitoring and evaluation of the actions carried out in order to improve public health response to heat. There is limited evidence on the periodic update of the plans and the interventions carried out specifically for vulnerable subgroups. When talking to the different stakeholders, what we found generally was that there is a lack of resources to carry out climate change and heat adaptation measures specifically related to personnel capacity and funding, but also sometimes there is the policy remit isn't clear. So there might be a heat adaptation plan, but then it's not clear who should be doing what in the different settings. And the more we go from national to local, this comes out as a very consistent aspect that was highlighted by the different policymakers. In terms of monitoring and evaluation of prevention measures, again, there was generally limited evidence on specific measures, and sometimes this hinders implementation because of the lack of information regarding what works and what doesn't. And another important aspect, obviously, is engagement between different stakeholders, vulnerable groups, and communities in order to improve adaptation. We summarized within MBEL results from this work in a series of different policy briefs you can find on our website, and it's also linked to the work carried out in Exhaustion, both on heat adaptation plans and vulnerable groups, and evidence on heat and co-exposures, so mostly air pollution and wildfires and droughts. What we need is to promote these action and preventions toward vulnerable subgroups and really ensure that we carry out further actions. Now the evidence is available. There is need for further research and right of evaluation of the interventions. And again, what we found within Europe is that COVID-19 recovery funding can really be a stimulus for health system surveillance to climate change and heat protection. And we should really make sure that when we're talking about climate change, health is always linked to that in a very strong way. And hopefully the Exhaustion project has really put this aspect on a map and made sure that this can be carried forward in the coming years. And again, the last point, but it's never the last one, is that we should have a greater focus on equity and social justice when carrying out heat adaptation response in different settings. And
thank you
for your attention.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And we will carry on by also listening to people who is doing this work on the ground. And I think a lot of your points is really valid into that discussion afterwards. But first, we will go a bit more into the social inequality, and I'll give the floor to Claire Slavinsky for her presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here presenting on behalf of my colleagues at Helmholtz Munich. So we are currently working on implementing a systematic review within the framework of thermal inequity, which is a newer concept in environmental justice research, just emerging in 2013. And what you see here is a definition from the two researchers who developed this framework, who say that thermal inequity is a distributive justice concern where socially marginalized communities that are least equipped for adapting to and mitigating the effects of a changing temperature baseline cope with the most adverse impacts. So within this framework of thermal inequity, we are implementing a systematic review of research, published research on inequalities in exposure to objectively measured heat stress, as documented through measuring surface and air temperature or urban heat island intensity, for example, subjectively measured heat stress, measured by asking people how they're feeling and whether they are experiencing some basic symptoms of heat stress, and related adaptive capacity, so measuring how able are people to avoid high temperatures or to cool down if they need to on hot days. So most studies look at acute or sudden and extreme outcomes, such as mortality or hospitalizations related to extreme heat events. So why are we concerned with exposure to heat and adaptive capacity and not those very acute health outcomes? So first and most important for policy and action is that if we know who is most exposed, we know where to intervene in the environment, and we can understand perhaps the best ways to prevent that exposure. But also with long-term and repeated exposure to high temperatures, people become more and more at risk of potentially developing kidney problems, cardiovascular problems, metabolic syndrome, anxiety and depression. And we also know that high temperatures are linked to higher suicide rates and higher rates of violence and crime. And we also know that high temperatures can result in productivity and economic loss, lower school performance, and an increased burden of adaptation and cooling costs. And over the long term, inequitable exposure to heat can then further deepen and worsen existing health, social, and economic inequality. So the systematic review is still underway, but what we're seeing is that thermal inequity is very context dependent, but in general, some groups tend to be more exposed to heat and less able to adapt. So we're finding that children, young people, and socially isolated elders, in alignment with the vulnerable groups for health impacts, they're more exposed. Racial and ethnic minorities, people with lower education, lower income, specific occupational groups, and people that are highly marginalized, people with low mobility, physical disabilities, severe mental illness, drug users, and unhoused and incarcerated populations. And also an intersectional perspective is really vital because we have to consider that these different aspects of marginalization may overlap and exacerbate thermal inequity. So I'll just show you a few examples of relevant studies that we have found during our systematic review. In this study, the authors looked at urban heat island intensity across neighborhoods of 25 cities around the world. This figure is showing the average daytime surface urban heat island intensity of the neighborhoods of each of these 25 cities, and the error bars on either side of the average intensity for each city represent the variability across different neighborhoods of the city, meaning that longer lines are showing larger differences across neighborhoods in that city. When comparing neighborhood urban heat island intensity by socioeconomic status, they found that in 72% of cities, urban heat island disproportionately affects people with lower socioeconomic status, but in 24% of the cities, actually people with higher socioeconomic status were more affected. So this really exemplifies our overall impression from the literature that it's a very context-dependent issue, but in general, people with social disadvantage are more exposed. We identified a few studies looking at data from cities in Europe, and here's one example of a study looking at average income and a few other social factors and environmental characteristics of neighborhoods in Oslo, Norway. So the authors of the study found that areas with lower average income, shown on the top left, had less greenness, which you can see on the bottom left, and a higher heat hazard ground cover, which is shown on the bottom right. Another important aspect to consider is race and ethnicity and migration background, and though we haven't finished the review, so far I have not seen any studies in Europe looking at disparities in exposure by race or ethnicity, and very few by migration background. Most of the evidence comes from the United States. This particular study looked at differences in daytime surface heat island intensity across zip codes in the United States. And the study calculated these measures for 175 large urbanized areas in the country. And they found that the average person of color lives in a census tract with higher surface urban heat island intensity than the average white person in all but 6 of the largest 175 urbanized areas. And what you're seeing now are maps of their results for the cities of Greenville and Baltimore. And you can see that the dark purple circles are mostly concentrated in the hottest parts of these cities, represented by the dark red and dark orange colors. And especially in Baltimore, you can see the deep red areas almost exclusively have the darkest purple circles, meaning that the people living there, they're over 80% of the people living there are non-Hispanic, Black, or African American. We're also seeing that the people who are generally the most at risk of acute health outcomes from heat are not necessarily the ones that are the most exposed to heat. This is data from a household survey of about 700 people from a city in Germany who lived in parts of the city that have higher temperatures. And you can see that actually students, young professionals, and families with children are the groups experiencing very high exposure and relatively lower adaptive capacity in the study, while seniors, and especially those over 75, are the least exposed. What we're also seeing in the literature is that we can't reduce adaptive capacity to just income. So we need to be asking who has access to and lives closer to public green space and blue space, such as public pools or rivers and lakes for their cooling effect and also for swimming. Who is using public transportation and who has to go to transit stops that don't have any shade or that are in hotter areas, and which children have access to cooler playgrounds with shade trees or shade coverings. So more research on the topic is needed in general, but most of the research that exists is coming from the United States and from China. And you can see here that 62% of the studies are coming from North America and East Asia. There were not very many studies on the topic from Europe, and most are coming from Germany that we've found. And in particular, we're finding that more research in Europe is needed on unequal exposure rather than health outcomes due to social factors among elders, young people, and children, different occupational groups, migrants, people with migration background, and racial and ethnic minorities, and these highly marginalized groups for which there's very little research in general. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Claire. And now we have dived into the research part of this. We will continue to hear more the city perspective or the national perspective from the governmental side. So we have invited 3 people, city experts from different levels, to give us some comments. So based on the introductions you've heard so far, what are the effective measures for developing a climate resilient, low emission city? And how can these be integrated into regional or local heath health action plan? And we will start with Colin O'Hare from the Department of Health in Ireland. So the floor is yours, Colin.
Thank you, Astrid, and hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I suppose, first of all, thanks to Kirsten and Antonio for setting the context very well and, saving me from having to do that. I suppose when you look at, I think the charts showing how Europe is experiencing the impacts of climate change, I think that Antonio's chart kind of showed that Ireland, in the context of heat, we haven't really been in a space where we're dealing with heat-related mortality to date, but obviously we're closely watching developments across Europe because I think as Kristen's chart showed, it's in the post unless we sort out our emissions. In Ireland, I suppose the main thing we have experienced is increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and that would include heat waves, and it is becoming more of a challenge in a country that maybe traditionally wouldn't be associated with heat waves. What we do have, I suppose, is a joined up approach to extreme weather events, and we've got a good cross-departmental, cross-sectoral structure that puts in place the key stakeholders involved in, if it's flooding or heat or whatever it might be. There's a solid cross-sectoral structure with good buy-in on that. In the context of heat, I suppose where we're focusing at the moment is on guidance for I suppose the most relevant, the most affected sectors, and we've developed a kind of a three-tier approach to informing on heat waves, where tier one would be the most vulnerable members of society, and a lot of that guidance might be more tailored towards the health sector and health professionals. Then tier two, I suppose, would be the generic heat wave across, that you'd get in a country for maybe a week, 10 days, or whatever we might experience, and guidance for the general public on what they need to do. And then tier three would be, I suppose, national emergency level, and we haven't, like I said, found ourselves in that space just yet. But I suppose the key is that you need to make sure, like, there's two ways of dealing with it. The first is the reactive situation where a heat wave occurs, and you look at, I suppose, ensuring that your meteorological services giving information in advance to the extent possible so that your system can be geared up and advice can be given, etc. Then I suppose the access to that advice, you need to make sure that there's consistent messaging from stakeholders on the importance of shade or liquid or whatever it might be. And then I suppose when you then your sectors themselves kind of are equipped so that if you need to provide water, or if there's some water shortages, that you're prepared in advance for that. The other side of it, and I suppose the side that we're kind of getting to grips more on now, where it's becoming more of a challenge, is the proactive aspect of this, where our local authorities are developing climate action plans, and they would include, on the adaptation side, what they're doing in that space. And I suppose most of our cities are on our coast, so a lot of that would deal with flood resilience, but it would also include, I suppose, guidance in terms of planning and, public spaces, shade, access to seating, etc. So that, I suppose, in terms of on the proactive side of things, will be one pillar. Then again, I guess that cross-sectoral engagement, so that you can ensure, like, say, our health sector's built environment, where you'd have some of the more vulnerable sectors of your population, to ensure that the infrastructure in which they are based during a heat wave isn't exacerbating their conditions, or if we can minimize the impacts of a heat wave. That, I suppose, is part of our long-term planning in terms of the maintenance of the health sector's built environment and on what's being designed coming down the road. So I suppose ultimately it's that kind of cross-sectoral coordination is central, I suppose, on it. And as our local authorities develop their climate action plans, we're seeing, like I said, the integration into those of both the mitigation side in terms of how they can support that, and then the adaptation side in terms of how they deal with, like I said, the various extreme weather events, which tend to be the main impacts that we're experiencing in Ireland. And I suppose all of this is informed by the long-term projections that are coming out of Europe and the global assessment of these things. So I suppose it's making sure that that information is to hand when you're developing plans, so you're recognizing not just where we at now, but in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, that you're teeing yourself up to be equipped to deal with that too. So that, in a nutshell, I suppose, is where we're at in Ireland. And I suppose we're publishing that guidance now on heat waves, particularly public-facing guidance on tier two. We'll be publishing that in the coming weeks, but it is, I suppose, based on experiences on heat waves and guidance from health professionals on the tailored guidance for younger people or older people, more vulnerable people, etc., just to make sure that's easily accessible, that if people are Googling this stuff, it's the first thing they find, and that you have a system then that's resourced to provide the support they can at that stage. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colin. Yeah, I really like the way you describe it as that both mitigation and adaptation, to kind of interlink everything within one plan. I will give the floor now to Panagiotis Slasladis from the patient organization European Federation of Allergy and Airways Diseases. I think you need to unmute yourself, Panagiotis.
Yes, is the sound right now?
You need to put it into presentation mode.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Just a minute. Yes. Just a minute, I'm sorry.
We see your presentation, in the right way. So if you try to click from one to the next.
Yes, okay, perfect. I am Panagiotis Cheslaridis. I am a senior advisor, policy advisor at the European Federation of Allergy and Airway Diseases Patients Associations, and I'd like to thank you very much for having me here. IFA, my organization, represents patients living with chronic respiratory diseases such as allergy, asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which affect around 200 million people in Europe in total. Obviously, respiratory patients are by definition more vulnerable to heat levels and therefore exposed to more severe health effects when exposed to extreme heat, as you very well know already. Now, this slide shows some key information about IFA. No need to go through it all, but we'll be happy to share my presentation later on for those interested. Just to mention the three key pillars that we work on, which is to inform, to prevent, and to care. And these three principles you will see go through my presentation that will follow. Now, one of the most prominent health hazards in Europe is the sustained increase in temperatures. As was shown in the previous presentations, we are hitting heat record levels and extreme lengthy ever more lengthier heat waves all over Europe, southern and continental Europe alike. Now, a few details about what the patient community, the respiratory patient community, believes that heat health action plans should look like. First of all, we think that it is absolutely important to have an effective early warning system in place. And according to WHO data from the report that was referred to earlier by Francesca in her presentation from 2021, only 16 countries in Europe have a heat warning system in place at the moment. So I believe we need to form a population-wide perspective. As such, plans should be expanded and be more holistic and widely used. Firstly, by establishing warning systems that are based on the interaction between temperature and pollution, as it's this interaction that can aggravate disease symptoms. And also with input from public authorities and scientists, especially from the meteorological institutions and as well as healthcare professionals, but also including citizen organizations to better identify the needs for the content of these systems. Secondly, they must be better integrated at local level across social services and civilian protection services, addressed to mitigate the effects of pollution. As we know, the main concern for governments and social services should consider how to protect those that cannot be protected by their own means, with options such as cool public places, daycare or telemonitoring, or even temporary unemployment schemes for certain workers during extreme heat periods. And thirdly, public information needs to be reinforced to be made accurate, timely, and accessible, also serving as an alert mechanism for the population with health-related advice tailored for vulnerable groups, including personal protection measures and social measures to be in place. And also needs to be transparent in explaining the complexity of the heat and its links with increase of pollen loads, for example, which is linked to seasonal allergy that many people suffer from. Overall, combating heat stress also requires investment in reducing its contributing factors, such as reducing air pollution, like it is the case for many cities at the moment through low emission zones, for example. Investment in public transport and green mobility to reduce transport emissions that contribute to health problems, but also effective forest fire prevention mechanisms. Secondly, I want to just before finalizing mention that heat may be a general weather phenomenon, but depends a lot on local factors. pollution levels, the interaction between built and natural environment, the air conditioning and ventilation. So adaptation, I agree, is key, with measures to break the heat island effect, with more parks, more green spaces, tree planting, but also with due consideration to avoid allergenic species when planting trees, but also fountains in urban settings and so on. And investment in energy efficient buildings, including requirements for the use of building materials that protect from heat. And finally, a very last point is that stakeholders should be, consultation and collaboration should be across stakeholders and sectors. All involved actors should collaborate at different governance levels, but also especially public services to fully integrate heat stress in the population in the plans for policies. Local environmental and health NGOs, such as patient organizations, who bear the voice of citizens and who bear disproportionate health burden, should also have a seat on the planning. IFA, very last point, as a members-based organization, is working a lot also at the EU and international level to insert these concerns about cross-border climate hazards such as heat into the emergency and response plans, like the EU HERA agency about health emergency and response preparedness. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. And then we will actually go to the local level and say hello to Stina Osland from Bergen Municipality in Norway.
Thank you, Astrid. I believe we're a little bit off time schedule, so I'm going to be quite brief. I've decided to focus on one issue. Bergen is kind of on the other extreme than heat waves. We are the wettest city of Norway at the moment. It feels like temperature might never rise higher than 11 degrees Celsius. But when we talk about weather extremes and what to prepare for in Bergen, I tend to quote our former prime minister, was the prime minister during the COVID pandemic. She said that we were prepared for a pandemic, just not this pandemic. And when I try to mobilize attention to heat waves and drought in extremely wet Bergen, I use that phrase because we need to pay attention to this as well. And I have to thank you for the very good presentations earlier today. I've made some notes on some studies we need to do, especially on vulnerable groups and differences. But I think that a key that I'm stuck with and that I keep coming back to no matter the topic is at the local level is land use and planning, because we can use land use and planning to prevent and prepare for a lot of these issues. We can plan to avoid local car use, to make public transport and car sharing and bike riding and walking the most accessible and the most reasonable way of moving about. We can plan for a more efficient and just public transport system and for it to be fossil free, which is one of the goals we are working hard on in Bergen. But not least to plan to preserve nature. But it will both help us to avoid heat islands, but also preserve carbon sinks, right? We need to do adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And I think that in land use planning and by setting nature as the boundary of what you can and cannot do, and by doing that also we comply with the Montreal Agreement for Nature, we can preserve green spaces and expand green spaces, which is extremely important when it comes to heat waves, but also for mental health. It's extremely obvious, both in the wet cities, but also in the hotter ones. And in the climate strategy for Bergen, which is actually called the Green Strategy, we propose 4 main attentions when it comes to climate measures or climate work in the city. We say that we need to cut the direct emissions, of course, but we also need to build a circular economy. And the third area of attention is to preserve nature, and the fourth is to prepare for change. And by preparing for a change, we mean the full spectrum of climate risk. But also the possibilities within it. And we say that our climate transformation, the climate transformation of the city of Bergen, needs to be just, and we are working quite a lot on how do we include justice, how do we include public health in how to deal with climate transformation. But I'm going to wrap up now, and I have to say that it's been I'm going to pay particular attention to the vulnerable groups and the green area development, making sure that we pay attention to who lives where and how do we keep developing the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stina. And now we will actually go on to talk a little bit about what Antonio mentioned before, the tools and the visuals from Exhaustion, the learning material that Exhaustion has produced. And first, I will give the floor to Christo Keraditis, this from Praxis, that will actually give us a small demonstration of the tool.
Thank you, Astrid. Can you see the full screen of my presentation?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a tool that is designed to help users prevent themselves from the effects of environmental conditions such as air pollution and heat stress. This tool is called Hacker. It was developed as part of an EU project a few years ago, and it was further enhanced with additional features during the Exhaustion project. So Hacker is a platform which is designed to facilitate access to information on air quality, thermal comfort, and probability of forest fires in Europe. It is accessible through a web platform and also through a mobile application available on both Android and iOS. It gives access to air quality data through an interactive map which presents information from monitoring stations, the official monitoring stations, and also sensors which are set up and operated by volunteers, users. These are not official information, but there is actually a lot of information available. So there are the two main data sources are the OpenAQ community, which includes basically the official monitoring stations with information from more than 10,000 locations. And there is the sensor.community group, which is a group of volunteers. And here there is also a lot of information from covering most of the world. But besides location-based data, the application also gives information about locations in which there are no sensors or stations. And this takes place through the use of data fusion, combining observations, model outputs, and Earth observation data. And also there are air quality forecasts for the following 2 days using the weather and research forecast model and also artificial intelligence tools. Besides air quality information, the application also provides information on the thermal comfort, which is the temperature felt by the human body in certain conditions, and also the probability of forest fires, which is the existence of favorable meteorological conditions for the ignition of forest fires. And I'm going to present a demo of the web application. allow me to share a video. So we are viewing the web application. A user can select a city, Prague in this example, and can turn on different layers of information. Now, this is the official stations. The colors are coded, so red means bad air quality, etc. And it's possible to see information on different pollutants, also information coming from the past days, and information about the intervals of measurements and the last measurement. Now, another layer is the sensors. These are coming from users, the unofficial measurements. So in the same way, it's also possible to see information about pollutants. Then this is the fusion map I was talking about in the presentation. So here we select a point. It doesn't have to have any sensors. And this is the information coming out from models about the current air quality. And also the air quality forecasts work like this. So the users can select a point on the map and can see the forecast for the following 2 days. Now this information is about the thermal comfort index. So we can zoom out to Europe. Actually, the situation is good because we are in the winter. And there are projections for the following 2 days and also for different times of the day, because it makes a difference for the thermal comfort, whether it's noon or morning, for example. And a similar layer is the forest fire index with projections for the following 2 days. And now we see how users can log in the application to see more personalized information. So there is the option to select a group. Here we have the example of athletes. So the user can join a group also and also select a location of interest on the map. Save the group. And then when we return to the map and turn on the groups layer, it's possible to see information about the air quality concerning the specific groups, concerning everyone, of course, but tips on the specific groups of users. And there are also some generalized recommendations about other vulnerable groups. Well, this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christo. Let's see if we can get out from your presentation again. There we go. I will then give the floor to Angela Morelli from Info Design Lab that will give us some insight in the illustrations.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my full screen presentation. The first slide. Yes. I hope that the silence means a yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes,
sorry.
That's okay. So my name is Angela Morelli, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of a small and medium enterprise called Info Design Lab. a socially conscious information design firm. We work with scientists and scientific organizations to turn complex data into unique visualizations, meaningful narratives, compelling messages, and engaging communication products. Over the next 8 minutes, I would like to give you an overview of the work we have been carrying out with the communication team at Cicero and with the researchers within the EXHAUSTION project. But I would like to start with the title, Visualizing Science for Impact. What do I mean here by visualizing science? And above all, what do I mean by impact? For those of you who might not be familiar with the discipline of information design, it is a field of research and practice within the broader field of communication design. Information design addresses the organization and presentation of data, its transformation into valuable, meaningful information. Visualizing data is one of the areas of information design. It will be our focus of the next 8 minutes. As a partner within the EXHAUSTION consortium, our goal was to co-design a number of visualizations with the aim of communicating selected research findings to specific target audiences, policymakers, researchers, lay people, and health practitioners. Why bother having information design specialists for this task? Because design is not just a way to give shape to content. Design is content. Design is a process, a strategic problem-solving process that allows us to elevate our understanding of the content by mapping out interconnections, facilitating dialogues among scientists, building bridges with the end users, involving key stakeholders, experiencing a learning journey together with the scientists, and understanding what channels are needed and what tools are necessary to meet our audience where they are. Meeting our audiences where they are. That's what I mean by impact. Information design is key to co-designing communication tools through engagement, beauty, and clarity. And as designers, we need to dive into the content with the guidance of the scientists because we need to build a deep and shared understanding of the nature of the data and the science that underpins it. But we need also to ensure the participation of the audience because ultimately we are aiming to empower them to see patterns and make informed decisions about the big challenges we face as a society, from education to health, from social justice to climate change. And in practical terms, this can get complicated because of the collaborative and iterative nature of the design process that involves different users and scientists and designers and stakeholders, and because it is not a plug and play process. But ensuring participation is the only way to get as close as possible to visualizing science for impact. And after partnering with scientific organizations from the IPCC to the WMO, from Cicero to the European Environmental Agency, we are witnessing how design can become one of the souls of communication and dissemination strategies across entire projects' ecosystems. I would like to show you some of the final results of this collaboration. The goal was to co-design 4 sets of communication tools that would cover 4 main pillars of EXHAUSTION, starting from an overview of the context in visualization 1, rooted in deliverables 3.1 and 3.2, going on with a representation of the problem in visualization 2, covering deliverables 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5, arriving at a mitigation and adaptation in visualization 3 based on deliverables 2.5, 4.1, 4.2, and 4.4, and finally getting to visualization 4, where we are covering the cost of inaction based on deliverable 5.2 and 5.3. And all the visualizations have a common theme. We breed climate change, which aims to hook the reader with an unusual metaphor to convey that climate change really seeps into our lives, affecting our bodies and society, ultimately influencing the overall economy. And for each set, we have a static visual, we have created slide decks to layer the presentations, we have created animations, we have co-written articles with the scientists and with the communication team. For visualization 1, the intent is that climate change worsens the health impacts of air pollution. The visualization has been translated into different languages, Norwegian, Greek, German, and here you can see the animated version of visualization 1 where the same intent has been visualized with an animation in a slightly different way to communicate research findings on social media. And then you can see here an article that has been published on the exhaustion to communicate the research findings. In visualization 2, the intent is that more people will die of lung and heart diseases in our cities when high temperatures are combined with high levels of air pollution. This is especially true for those of us who are 65 and older. And we have one set for heart diseases and one set of visualizations for lung diseases. We have explored the metaphor of shadows to convey heat, and we have made sure that human presence can remind readers that ultimately we as humans are hit by the consequences. Here is the set for lung diseases. In order to show the intent, we illustrate the change in number of deaths from lung diseases by different levels of air pollution. And based on in-depth interviews and user feedback, we decided to visualize not only the overall estimate for Europe, but also the data on different cities, European cities, as readers would connect to the data more easily. And this is the same for heart diseases. In visualization 3, we have 2 tracks, one on mitigation and one on adaptation. The set on mitigation is based on data for 2 different scenarios. The intent in this visualization is to show that by the end of the century, climate change in Europe could have claimed over 2,100,000 or 730,000 lives, depending on the scenario, but policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions could save most of them. Here is the visualization for sustainable path, SSP1. Here is the visualization for the unsustainable path, SSP3. The central large panel to the left is visualizing the estimated total number of excess deaths attributed to temperature between 2020 and 2100. We have actually visualized 2,195,505 dots for SSP1 and 731,500 dots for SSP1. We know that 1 dot will never truly capture the immense value of the human life, but we wanted to convey the magnitude of the problem. And each dot represents a single human life that is potentially lost. To create this visualization, we use the D3 and the code is available. We have also created individual assets that are used in this article on the Exhaustion website that you can explore. In the visualization 3B, the focus is adaptation. It is a qualitative visualization, and the intent is to show that policies that increase the ability to adapt to climate change and decreased vulnerability can serve as a protective shield for citizens' health. We have both a static and an animated version. We even used poetry in haiku style and collaborated with poet Uda Aunan and a set of 8 animations to convey the adaptation measures included in the visuals. Last but not least, the 4th visualization on the cost of inaction. Again, a qualitative visualization where the intent is to show that climate change impacts the work productivity of people exposed to high temperatures, and the individual effects ripple through different paths, ultimately influencing the overall economy. And we use the metaphor of shadows and the language of an axonometric urban landscape, symbolizing society where elements are interconnected and dynamic. The goal was to show ripples that reverberate from the micro to the macro level. And to manage the complexity of the design process, we have created digital spaces for collaborating with everybody involved in the process and for recording the history of each visualization. It has been almost like working in track changes for the visualizations. You can download all the assets that we have created by using this article on the Exhaustion website. We would like to thank all of you for joining today, and we would like to thank Cicero for giving us the opportunity to be design partners. This has been an inspiring learning journey for us, and I'm really excited to see how this material will be exploited in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Some of you have posted questions in the chat while this webinar was going on, and some of them are answered already. I would also ask if you have some questions or some comments, please type them in now because we have a few minutes in the end. And also for all of you guys who have presented, if you have any comments or anything you want to add, please raise your hand because I can see your hands. But we have one question from Marisol. My question is for Stina, considering the HA's AP is usually under the scope of work of national health authorities. Is it feasible to reinforce top topics as land use and planning in HA's AP, being those topics usually out of the scope / control of health authorities? How can that be materialized in a successful way? Thank you. I don't know, Stina, if you have a comment.
HHAP.
Yeah.
What does it stand for? Heat Health Action Plan, right? Yes.
I guess so.
I would say that that by working a bit more across sectors than we traditionally do, at least in my municipality, and by expanding what you consider as the knowledge basis of land use and planning, I would say that you could fit them at least a little bit better together. At least here we are talking more and more about how can we show the public health benefits of greening, how can we use data to enhance the link between public health and land use to enhance the probability of moving forward in the direction we want, in the direction needed, because there is no doubt that the goal conflicts at the local level on what to fit within our scarce resource, which is land, is definitely a very, very prominent goal conflict. And I think that at least here we do see the need for good data on the links between public health and land use, and especially the conservation of nature. So I would say that at least for the bureaucratic side of decision making and policy making on this topic, I would say that very good knowledge bases and how to actually put forward the links and demonstrate the value of it would enhance, I don't know, the probability of actually fitting the two tasks together. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's at least my angle to it and what we are working on here.
Thank you, Stina. We also got a question, heat from Dario, heat stress exposure risk management related to occupational health settings in Europe. Which methods do you recommend for hazard identification and control when direct sunlight or other radiant sources are not present? And I can see Colin raising his hand.
Thank you, Astrid. And I was in the process of typing.
Something is wrong with your sound. Maybe you have to put down your mic.
Does this help? Sorry about that. No, I was typing a response to that, but I think it's handier to actually say it. I suppose this is something that may vary from region to region, but in an Irish context, we have engagement through our skin cancer prevention plan with employers groups who bring together input from specific, particularly outdoor workers and the like. And we would use that as a channel both for us to provide information and also to get information back up the line for specific sectors which may face specific challenges. And I'm guessing if Dario's from Croatia or that part of the world, it may be that the impacts of heat in that environment may be greater than in an Irish context. But if you have, I suppose, a channel of communication where tailored responses are identified by specific employers or whatever it might be, that you can then feed that out across the system and make sure that examples of good practice get replicated and maybe learn from experiences of other groups. I think Kristen might have something to add as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I see your hand. So Kristen.
Yeah, I agree to what you say, Colin. And of course, there are kind of two different, or there are several, but you can divide between, outdoor workers working in hot conditions, and there are certain measures and way to analyze that. But in Exhaustion project, we also want to mention that we actually did a survey of what we call work presenteeism, which is among office workers. Usually you think they are protected. This was actually done in the UK, and the result shows that people working indoors in office settings, their self-reported work productivity was affected by temperature. So this is a way of, I mean, it's really difficult to analyze or to study how worker productivity are impacted in indoor or when there's not specific, outputs from your work or concrete. So then it's this self-reported presenteeism, as it's called, was a way of analyzing that. And of course, you can also look at sick leave days and other, which is maybe more concrete and there are easier available data. But so there are many different aspects related to this topic and then different methods needed. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I now have no more questions. If any of you have any last comments, now is the time to sign up. Let's see, there was another one coming. For Angela, which sectors, in addition to climate change, should invest in generate a better and more accessible way of displaying scientific data, which are more behind in this topic?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Of course, like the collaboration with Exhaustion has been quite central in our work, quite important in our work in the past years. But we focus a lot, not just like on climate science. We focus on health science. We focus on sustainability in general. So I would say that in every branch of science, we know that communication is absolutely crucial because information is powerful only if it can be understood, right? And I would say that the work we do as information design specialists is absolutely important because together with communication teams, we can really try to understand the right storylines and the right key findings that have to be communicated according to the different target audiences. But above all, we can implement a participatory approach in order to craft the right communication to reach those target audiences. So just to answer the question in brief, I think that every scientific communication teams should lean on information design specialists when it comes to effective communication.
Yeah, and I guess in the end, it's all about reaching those people out there who need this information to make sure that, because plans doesn't do us any good if they're in a drawer somewhere and nobody reads them and nobody gets the message from them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't get any more questions. So with that, I think I will just say thank you so much to all of those of you who presented. And of course, all of you that listened in and participated in this webinar. And as I mentioned in the start, this is the last day of Exhaustion, but there will be more products and more information coming from the project also after it has ended. So thank you so much to all of you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.